Please rise. Join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all for being here. Let me first congratulate, as we speak, we have the graduating class of 2011 tonight at the high school, so good luck to all the graduates. We just had lights come on underneath here, that's why you're seeing a bunch of people looking over here. I wish them all the best of luck. Item 2 now comes before us, non-routine applications. For that, I'll call on our budget chair, Mike Mason.
First item is ED 8, Board of Education, transfer $87,289.75, North Miana's parking lot, and I so move that on behalf of the Budget Committee.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
Good evening, everyone. ED8 is the Budget Committee again took up this item for the second time. The RTM on this particular item has chosen not to approve the method of an interim appropriation for this capital project, which leaves our board under charter discretion to transfer uncommitted appropriations from one item to another. As you will see, we will use uncommitted balance from 4 other Board of Ed capital projects within the current year, and I'll list them very quickly for everyone. Glenville School had a surplus in the project they did there. The roof replacement on one of the other projects had money left over on another roof replacement, and the modular removal gave us a subtotal equal to the overspending that took place. This will permit the controller to reallocate the finances back to the Board of Ed operating budget to get their accounts restored to the proper position, and it'll also cover the added expense. It'll increase the level of spending for that appropriation. As we all know, this was a series of errors on behalf of the town, which caused a lot of controversy. We had it a month ago, and we just, took care of the item at that point. Our vote, there's really not much to say on this. It's something we need to be more concerned that we don't do things like this going future. But our vote was 4-0 in favor of these transfers.
Discussion. I think just so that it's crystal clear with the public especially, this is simply taking transfers from uncommitted capital accounts of the Board of Education and transferring them over to the North Miana's parking lot capital project. The BET, pursuant to the charter, has the right to do this. We could have done this without RTM approval from the beginning. We have, as a matter of policy, we do not transfer funds without RTM approval so that there's greater transparency relative to those transfers. But because of the action by the RTM in rejecting the request for an additional appropriation, we are transferring the uncommitted balances of other Board of Education capital accounts to this account to pay the bills. And then those accounts which would have returned money back to the capital non-recurring fund are simply smaller and will not return that money to the fund. Okay. Further discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. I know Mr. Kelly is out on business and out of the country. Okay. Mr. Mason.
Next item we have is FD1, Fire Department. This is for $240,000. This is for a transfer, overtime services. And I move that on behalf of the Budget Committee.
Moved by Mr. Mason. Second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
FD1, Chief Kick came before the committee to discuss this transfer. The department has incurred a larger than usual amount of overtime due to firefighters out on injury leave. The normal process that we have in the town in our normal budget can usually handle some of this. However, we've had, in this particular case, there's been 2 officers out for extended leave with serious injuries, causing the needed coverage this year. The fire department has a normal plan where if one person calls out, they can backfill that with some of the floaters. But in this case, over the past year, the amount of shifts being missed, they just needed to hire overtime. Our controller also noted on this that just these 2 individual cases, our workers' comp numbers exceeded $700,000, which, as you know, the town is self-insured. So for these two items, the transfer will come out of the fire department's other operating expenses to cover this, and this will get them in line for the June 30 closeout this year. And on behalf of the Budget Committee, our vote was 4 in favor, 0 against.
Discussion. I know we have the fire department here with as a Chief Kick. This is more of a rhetorical question, but one thing that I'd like to see is why it is that we can't use volunteers to cover the overtime shifts when necessary as yet another reason to migrate to a fully combined workforce. And I think going forward, one thing that I would like to see is in cases where we know there's overtime and we know we can plan for it, and we have protocols set up for volunteers to actually be committed to going, because I know that's another concern where if you need them there, they need to be there and they need to know that they're committed to covering that shift. But I would like to see the department look towards reducing overtime by using more volunteer services, even on a one-off situation. And I think that would be a greater benefit for both the town and the department overall. So something to look forward to in the future.
Yes, we can look into that again. As I said earlier, we did attempt that twice in the past, and the volunteers were reluctant to commit to it. We can put it out there again and report the findings, back to you. Maybe things have changed over the years. Maybe we have some younger guys that can commit blocks of time. So I'll gladly put that out there and report back.
Sounds good. Discussion on this item. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. Mr. Mason?
Our next item is LW1 for the Law Department. This is a release of conditions for personnel services for $239,000, and I so move it on behalf of the Budget Committee.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
LW1, Town Attorney Fox came before our committee on our release of conditions, as well as I believe they also visited with the Law Committee of the BET also. The BET during the last budget process had come to the conclusion that we decided that we want Mr. Fox, what we need was the question I think that came out of the budget deliberation. What does the town need for a law department? And it was the emphasis on going forward. The town has changed its strategy on how we've dealt with certain cases, so we've gone before that. As you can see from your handouts, Mr. Fox gave a report that went to the Budget Committee and also the Law Committee on changes that are being made, changes that are possibly being made, the differences in how the attorneys work today between equipment and the other issues that go. We encourage Mr. Fox, an example might be special education attorney. For the long time, the town has outsourced that, and we're looking to maybe in future budgets create a dedicated position for that rather than a part-time. We've noticed that land use, the town has a dedicated attorney just for land use, and we've seen a much better, from our land use agencies, much better service, and the product that comes out of the law department is much more refined, and everybody seems to be happy with it. The town has been through some very difficult cases under Mr. Fox's leadership and direction. With this, his recommendation for a step-by-step process to continue to develop the department should be good for our community. During the next budget process, or two, we should expect requests and dialogue relating to these type improvements. With that, our committee voted 4-0 to release the condition, which would include the $239,000 in the law department budget, and our vote was 4-0.
Further discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. Mr. Mason?
The next item on the agenda is ED6 for the Board of Education, which is actually for the Building Committee. It's a release of conditions for the MISA project. The Budget Committee did not take this item up. This was an item that would be going to the full BET for discussion on that one.
Yeah, so let me just offer a little bit of insight into this one. So as everyone here on the board knows, we have two conditions on MISA. We have the Building Committee release of conditions relative to all the contracts. We'll get to that under ED7. ED6 is the release of conditions based on the 501c3 and the private donations. Because that discussion, I thought, was a better discussion for the full board, it did not go to the Budget Committee first, and so it's going to be presented to us tonight by that organization, and I know there's several of their members are here to present that. I don't know who's going to present it. I don't know if it's you, Jenny, or...
Well,
I'm Jenny Krob. I'm a member of the steering committee for the campaign for MISA, and with us also tonight are 3 members of the campaign board, Pam Spear and Neil Greeley, who are co-presidents, and Hillary Stark, who's the treasurer. And what we were thinking of doing is responding to your questions. We don't really have a presentation because we submitted a 5-page report.
Fair enough. So can I have a motion to release the conditions as it relates to, and I will also say, it's relating to the full amount because there really is no number for it to relate to. We never put a condition on a partial amount. We are releasing, if we approve this, the full amount, but obviously that full amount of 17 million is still subject to the other subject to release, which is through the building committee.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino.
Second.
Second by Mr. Raymer. Okay. Discussion. Ms. Krob is correct. You should have received your actually written report in the first packet, the Budget Committee packet, relative to the donations and the pledges and things of that nature. Discussion on that written report. Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, I think first I'd like to say it's great the way we have the opportunity to have donations by the residents of Greenwich for such a large project. But I think that I would like to ask the question, what is the process for naming opportunities on the town buildings? I think we really don't seem to have one in place. And I guess the next one would be, if there was oversight, should it go beyond the Board of Education? Because after all, this is a town building. And should there be some kind of oversight or process naming the BET and/or the RTM to also basically, have some input into the levels of the contributions for naming rights? I'd also add, should there be a vetting process for names on town buildings, or is it only money talks? And, just to make sure that the names, when we use a name, have the prestige that we should have on town buildings. Again, I think the other issue here is who decides on the terms. In this case, it's pledges, not donations. Who decides on the terms of a pledge? And, again, in this case, that, obviously we value the contributions, but it's the town that takes the risk on the front end, and then obviously these come in. But I think the bottom line is, I think this identifies that perhaps there should be some process in place, whether it's the Board of Education, whether it's Nathaniel Witherall, and, should there be some ordinance that would begin to frame out, naming rights, either relative to the size of a building or, the value of a project or something else. Anyway, just some questions that, again, we have no process in place, and it's great to know that there'll be some money coming in. It's super.
Mr. Norton.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask the question whether or not this, what we have in front of us on appendix page 2, represents all the facilities, meaning all the components of the facility. Can you answer that, Jenny?
What are we talking about?
The written report.
You'll see in Appendix 2, there's a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10
Right.
facilities. The Board of Ed's policy on this has been not to accept naming for instructional facilities. The facilities that they've agreed to name are related to the community use, performance space, and support facilities. And there may be a couple of other opportunities that could be offered there. We have suggested a few additional opportunities to the Board of Ed, but it's up to them to approve the facilities and the naming levels for those, so we haven't heard back yet.
Okay, the point I'm making is, as you know, I chair the 501c3 for the Bentheim Western Greenwich Civic Center, and we had identified the naming rights and value of all the naming rights for all elements of that building, every room within the building. And I would encourage, if that's possible, that the same methodology and model be used.
I can certainly relay that back to the Board of Education. Thank you.
Further questions or discussion? So just so it's clear, and I know we talked to the comptroller and the finance department about this in terms of cash flows. As you know, on the pledge forms, there are, as the cash comes in from the pledges, then they'll just make the contributions to the town and then offset when we go out to bond the total amount that we go out to bond on this project. Okay? Mr. Raymer.
Yeah, it may be a technical point, but if you look at the blue sheet on the cover, the condition that's quoted there isn't exactly the condition that was approved. That was a small misnomer, and our capable clerk looked back at the record and corrected it in the minutes. I believe the condition only calls for the acceptance of a report and not the annexing copies of pledges, et cetera, which was an inadvertent error that had crept in, but unfortunately it carried forward to this blue sheet. I don't think it's going to matter much. I think the vote's going to go forward, but perhaps just take the moment to just make that technical correction.
Ms. Crump?
I just wanted to point out that the funds are not necessarily dispersed as received because there's a condition that the auditorium and support facilities have a temporary certificate of occupancy before the campaign will disperse funds.
So you're saying that no funds will be dispersed until 2014?
I can't tell you what the schedule is, Joe, but no.
13?
2012. Yeah, the end of the project is that. I'm not sure if you're just talking about the auditorium.
Just the auditorium and support facilities component of it.
That would be 2030.
Okay. Further questions? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. Thank you. ED 7 now comes before us. Now, this is the release of conditions from the Building Committee. It's for 1.8. Mr. Mason.
ED7, Board of Ed, Building Committee, $1.8 million, release of conditions on MISA, and I so move that on behalf of the Budget Committee.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
If I may. ED7, MISA. The Building Committee Chairman, Joe Ross, gave our committee an outline of the project and how they were going to use and control the $1.8 million. Our goal was to set up a standard for the information we would be looking for going forward as the series of contracts come in throughout the process, looking to have a standardized process for review. They are tapping into the contingency fund from the architect with these current contracts for work, but have a 5% contingency built into the additional 1.8 that we're doing here this evening. There are a few items that were not in the original scope of work that will need to be addressed at some point, the trees as an example. Our committee has asked the finance to set up a master folder in the department to log all documents, emails, etc. in order. Music background is great. We all want to be able to trace the steps of the MISA project as we joke with the friends of the next big project, the roadmap being set up ahead of time. It certainly appears with the soft economy, the contractors will be more amenable to practices that benefit the town. Certainly the bids should be, and as indicated, will be under some of the original estimates from Turner Construction just from a year ago. I might be off by a year or so ago. Our process was to release the 1.8. Our vote was 4.0 in favor of that. Going forward, looking to, again, the most important thing is looking to set up a standardized procedure for review of these contracts moving forward. We had a fairly lengthy discussion on this one, and we were fortunate that we had a majority of the BET there. This is a project that's obviously going to be moving forward. It's going to start rather quickly, I would think. There's general conditions involved. It seems like they have a handle on it, and good speed. Obviously, you know, we've done a lot of capital in the town, but our committee so far supported this 4-0 on this release so far.
Discussion. So I think once again, part of what we do here with our subjects to release, one is to help educate the RTM when they pass their budget to make sure that they understand that we've taken the time to look at this. But it's also then as the year goes by after the budget season and budget decisions are made to educate the public. And so one of the criticisms of MISA that was stated in a lot of the public hearings is the fact that there was going to be cost overruns and that we really didn't have a notion of where the costs were going to come in or the size or scope of the project. And so one of the things that the BET is looking at and the length of the discussion really related to what did Turner evaluate this portion of MISA, how much did they value it at, did the bids come in at or under the estimated value, and then how are we using contingency? So I think the conversation was a productive one. At this point in time, it does not appear, at least based on the contracts, that contracts are going over what Turner had estimated at, and in fact, it's slightly under as projected. Although there are already known elements that were not inside the scope, such as the trees, which contingency is going to have to be used for. So we'll continue to monitor this with the building committee. They'll come in anytime that a contract is ready. I suspect that we're going to get a boatload in July.
Probably September.
Even better, because our July calendar is filling up, so that's fine. And then we'll resolve those contracts and see where they come in vis-a-vis Turner's estimate, which I think will then set us up for a productive discussion in February when the next budget cycle is going through and the remainder of MISA is going through to see where we are relative to our estimates. So with that, further discussion? All those in favor of ED7 signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. Item 3 now comes before that. I'll call on our clerk, Joe Pellegrino, for routine applications.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, we have 10 routine applications this evening. The first comes from the Fire Department. It is FD2. It is a request to accept a grant from the state of Connecticut for additional dry hydrant installations. That request is $126,200.
No, we'll go through. I think Mr. Pellegrino just moved that item.
I did.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Mason.
Thank you.
I will do a discussion after all of these, so
Right.
we're going to run through all of them, and then we'll come back.
Okay, the next one comes forth from Nathaniel Witherall. This is NW3. This is a request to transfer from various accounts to employee health, medical supplies, and food cost, $296,800.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Simon.
Okay. The next one comes from Department of Public Works. This is PW 13. This is a request to carry forward a capital appropriation of $300,000. This will be used for the construction of the new number 6 restroom at Greenwich Point.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Simon.
Okay, the next one is PW 14, also a request to carry forward capital for $300,000, and this will be used for completing the design of the grit removal system at Grass Island.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Simon.
Okay, our next one, also from the Department of Public Works, PW 15, request to carry forward capital of $500,000. This will be used for, I believe it's for design studies for the drainage at Brothers Brooks and East Putnam Avenue.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Simon.
Okay, our next one is PW 16. This is another request to carry forward capital allocation of $500,000, and this is for the Holly Hill Master Plan.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Simon.
Next one, PW 17. This is another request to carry forward capital. The amount is $1,500,000, and this is for the Coscob Power Plant site remediation.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Simon.
Okay. Last one from Public Works is PW 18. This is another request to carry forward capital for $100,000, and this is regarding a roadway survey.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Simon.
Okay. The next one comes from the First Selectman. This is SE 13. This is a request to use a grant for the total of $63,515, and it will be used in various coastal resource advisory categories.
It's not a grant, it's from the coastal, it's from a triple R fund. It's
A triple R fund, I apologize. Triple R fund is the source, and it's going to be used in coastal recovery advisory.
Coastal resources.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Simon.
Okay. And the last one on the routine calendar is Board of Ed. This is ED5. This is a request to carry forward capital, $525,000 for doors and windows.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion, Mr. Mason.
If I may, just as for everybody to fully understand, a lot of these that you hear continue to enforce, the town charter is very clear, with the exception of certain bridge projects and some of the school projects, that we are allowed to continue an appropriation in force for a second year if the department shows justification. After that, it would lapse. This year, the town will be lapsing just shy of $2.2 million. I'm looking at our budget director and asking, which will revert back to the capital non-recurring fund for appropriations on other projects. These are the projects on the list that we have chosen to continue in force for the department to get done. This is the time of the year where we're getting ready for fiscal year closeout, but also this is when we find how our throttle is working, what our ability to get projects done and commit. Why haven't we committed yet? We have this list of CIP projects. So it's a very important time of the year in our budget process. We're closing out the annual year. It also sets up fund balance for the next year. So it's really interesting and a lot of work. You can see we had a lot of these items, and I just wanted to make mention of that.
Further discussion on any of these items? Let me just make a point of PW 17, the Coscob Power Plant site remediation. So in your packet from the Budget Committee to tonight, you should see the spending through June 16th, 2011, and that summary. So I think that's a useful tool in terms of any constituent who wants to understand how much we've spent, when we've spent it, and what's available. And so I think as we go forward, I think the number that jumped out, at least to me, was the 12-13 budget, where there is an anticipated request of $5.545 million for the park construction, and that's after all of the remediation is done, and so that's something that will have to be resolved or reviewed for the 12-13 budget. Further discussion on any of these items? Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. At this point, I'm going to ask the indulgence of not only the board, but of the assessor, and ask if it would be at all possible to entertain a motion to simply take up what is under old business, Project Renew, what has been presented as NW4, and I know that's not on the agenda, so for the purposes, I guess, of this motion, if we could just take up the Project Renew discussion at this time and out of order, and if that would be appropriate, simply as the numbers suggest that there are 4 individuals here from Nathaniel Witherell, and I'd like to have that discussion before we get into some of our other points, if the assessor is okay with that. Okay.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino.
Second.
Second by Ms. Tarkington. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. Okay. So just so it's clear, what's before us now is simply the discussion of Project Renew. I'm going to back up a little bit, if I may, and explain why this is on the agenda, because I know as a board we have not discussed it, or certainly in my plan as I laid it out last month in terms of what was going to be on our agendas for the remainder of the term, this was not on our agenda. On Friday, I was alerted by our comptroller that the MI approval process through the Board of Selectmen had been slightly derailed in terms of the fact that while the Board of Selectmen had approved municipal improvement for planning and zoning to then adjudicate, there was an issue relative to the timing of that adjudication, and I believe there's a statutory requirement of 90 days for that to be resolved. In light of that, I thought it would be wise for us to have a discussion as a board in terms of what was necessary, because at that point on Friday, my understanding was that additional documents were needed for planning and zoning to take up the matter, as they had not had any, for lack of a better term, I'll say generically, design drawings to resolve MI. As a result of those discussions, it became obvious, which is now before you, not before you, which you have a document that references a request for $100,000 to approve design drawings so that not only the MI approval process can proceed, but also so that both this body and the RTM would have additional information to take up Project Renew and resolve it. So that's why it's on the agenda this evening. But let me take a step back just to let you know what the timeline, at least before this past Friday, was, and whether or not it changes, I don't know, but and I think it's still in place. But let me at least describe it one more time. So HDG is under contract. We have a project team made up of various Nathaniel Witherell individuals, RTM representatives, and BET representatives. On that committee from the BET, again, is Mr. Raymer, Ms. Tarkington, Mr. Simon, and myself. The comptroller is really the head of the committee in terms of organizing and getting data to HDG. HDG is still on schedule to present to us in July. And we hope to get their analysis in July for their review of what I call revised Project Renew. We will then take that presentation in July and then vote on Project Renew in the form of a bonding resolution in September. The goal was also, and this we still have to work out with the RTM, but hopefully we would be able to have Nathaniel Witherell also give to the RTM for a first read that same bonding resolution in September. Then for the RTM to resolve and vote upon Project Renew in October, leaving, the RTM doesn't meet in November, leaving a 1-month lag or cushion, if you will, to try to have Project Renew voted on, certainly within this term, and I mean this term meaning this BET and this RTM, so that you didn't have to segue into a new RTM and new BET, and I won't say start from ground zero, but certainly with all of the institutional knowledge and all of the time and energy that various members of the RTM in this body have put into it. So that's the plan, irrespective of what we do tonight. And the discussion that occurred and the document that you have in front of us is relative to the request for additional documents, so not only that the MI process can proceed, but so also that we can keep on the time frame of this, the layout, the time frame as I've just laid out, which was July HDG, September vote by the BET, October or December vote by the RTM. I think I've covered the full picture as to why we're here and why we're having the discussion, and then it'll be up to this body. And I know it's short notice about whether or not we think it's appropriate first to entertain the request for the $100,000 to do the drawings, and then if it is appropriate to take up, whether or not then we vote on it. And for that, I'll call on David or anybody else from Nathaniel Witherell who'd like to say a few words, if you wish, or if there are questions for Nathaniel Witherell. And I'll certainly try to help answer any questions as well, although I think I've just given you the full extent of my knowledge of this process. But with that, Mr. Raymer?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I wonder if you'd assist me with answers to two questions. Is it your understanding that we're likely to have the report from HDG by the time of the July meeting? To the best of your knowledge?
Let's just say that there has been, we fully expect HDG to present to us in July. Just the nature of this, and if you recall, the first Project Renew, there's a vast amount of information that needs to be digested and then turned around. So to say that I am as confident as I'd like to be, the answer is no, but I do think that there's a strong likelihood that we'll have that presentation made in July.
I had been aware of there being some correspondence from HDG indicating a concern on their part about whether they'd be ready in time for July, but I don't know what happened after that. Does it appear to the chair that perhaps that was resolved such that we're likely to be somewhat more likely to be getting answers by July?
The short answer is yes. I firmly believe that based on communications and conversations that have been had, HDG will be here in July to give that presentation.
May I ask a second question?
Please.
I'm not knowledgeable about the 90-day requirement that you referred to in your description a few moments ago. Might I ask what that 90-day limitation referred to?
My understanding is that if a municipal improvement application is not taken up within 90 days of its filing, and I hope I'm trying to be loose in my words and not technical because, quite frankly, I have not seen the statute. But my understanding is if upon the filing of an MI application, if it's not taken up within 90 days, it's automatically deemed approved. And I don't think there's anybody within town government that wants to have such a major project approved simply because it wasn't taken up or there was insufficient documentation for it. And my understanding is that planning and zoning has administratively, I won't say rejected, but indicated that of their reluctance to take it up without the proper documentation. One other timing issue that you should be aware of, my understanding is that for the design drawings, it's approximately 45 days from the release of funds to be able to generate the design to the drawings that are being suggested, and therefore, if approved tonight, that would be 45 days out to get the drawings. So on one hand, it is still possible to have these drawings to us before our September vote if we don't vote this up tonight. At the same time, however, it does delay the MI process and doesn't allow any real cushion there in terms of timing. So I think it's really for this body to be able to digest even on such short notice. My sense was I wanted this body to be fully informed as we weren't going to have another opportunity to meet until the July meeting, and I would rather have this body either vote this up or down tonight, put it off to July, do whatever it wishes, but I thought it would better that we actually had the option of doing that as opposed to having this meeting just run past us and then have the chair just comment on it and have the membership say, well, I would have liked the opportunity to have taken this up. So that's why we're here. I know Nathaniel Witherell is here. I've had several conversations with them informally over the last 2 business days just about where they are and what their hopes and expectations are. I should also say, just so for the public, I know everybody up here knows this, the 1.3 that the BET froze, there's no real charter provision for that. It's more of a gentleman's understanding or a gentleman's and ladies' understanding as to that money being frozen. If you recall, once everyone knew that Project Renew in its original form wasn't going forward and there was 1.3 approximately appropriated, the decision at that time with the BET voted to say stop all expenditures. And so that's why we're here tonight, is that Nathaniel Witherell, can't spend any money of that 1.3 relative to Project Renew. Ms. Spartan.
I have another question. When does the 90-day period expire?
David, if you know.
I believe belief, it is 90 days after the May 5th filing by the Board of Selectmen application to the P.
Right, May 5th was the application, at least that's what I've seen from the First Selectman's office. Mr. Simon?
I mean, even if we appropriate the money tonight, you're never going to get, there's no guarantee. And if P and Z doesn't act, and then the RTM's not going to act by August 5th. I mean, you're going to get an automatic MI status without anybody voting?
No, I think, Mr. Simon, and this is based on discussions I've had with Diane Fox, if the $100,000 was released this evening, we would have construction drawings by the roughly the 15th of August. Diane needs 30 days within which to distribute those construction drawings internally to the Planning and Zoning Department. It would then be taken up at the September 13 meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission. But to me, the real advantage of being able to move on this issue is that it simply avoids the delay of 3 to 4 months, which we're otherwise going to have to face. If these monies were not released until you were to approve the project in September, we then have a 3 or 4 month process.
The relationship between the RTM taking this up as a first reading and it being approved by P and Z?
Well, theoretically, none. I think there's an advantage, however, to being able to represent that all of the required municipal approvals have been obtained. Worst case scenario, if they take it up in September and act upon it in October, that would be well beyond the September 13th meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission that we're shooting for.
So if we defer this to the July, personal inclination would be to wait till I saw the HDG report before I approve this, to spend another $100,000. But it would be also, I also would like to have a sense of the timetable involved. It's not so easy to do this, but we could try. That if we release this on July 18th, you would have your drawings ready by the end of August or the beginning of September, and you wouldn't be going to P and Z until October.
If they meet in October.
I think they meet every other week. P and Z does.
But I'm not quite sure of your logic, though. Why, if you're not acting on Project Renew, there's a risk at the July meeting that you're not fully persuaded that we're going to have Project Renew come September?
If I wasn't persuaded that we're going to do Project Renew, I would not want to spend $100,000. If we knew for sure we weren't going to do Project Renew, I wouldn't want to spend $100,000. And it's, it's not a trivial sum of money.
Well, I think on a risk-reward basis, the advantage of being able to pursue all of the requirements for approvals that we need for Project Renew, there's an advantage to the savings of 3 to 4 months. That
Well, I think the more important thing is, as Mr. Walco said to me, which is to have everybody who's currently elected vote on this issue. To leave it after December to a group that's starting in January would be very difficult. So I just have to spend a minute thinking about the timetable.
Mr. Mason and then Mr. Pellegrino.
Just a few quick questions. You have currently renderings we've seen, and you've made your presentation here. These drawings are in addition to that?
Yes, they supplement it, Mr. Mason. Those drawings that you've seen were based on the project at $36.883 million.
So these drawings
kitchens,
would scale back to a different level?
correct, a $22.5 million project.
So let me make a statement to the board. I'm not sure those drawings that we saw when the project was 36 million or 32 million were enough for me to make a decision at that point. So now the project's changed. So if those weren't enough, I would think we would need to see some, speaking for us, I would think we would need to see something in more detail before we pass this along. At the same time, when we get HD's report back, it's almost, the financials, you have to be able to plug it. You have to be able to plug it into the drawing and to see it work. So for that reason, I would think from our point of view, and I would think the RTM, as they normally would, they're going to look at it the same way we are. They're going to want to see the drawings to be able to make their decision. That would just be my thought. I would think it would be something, almost a tool we need to make our decision, and I would think the RTM would want the same. That would just be my overall thought on it. It's not really about the dollar amount or that. It's more just the process and the information that we would want to have before we made our commitment. Oh, sorry, Mr. Pellegrino.
Two questions, Mr. Chairman. One, following up on Mr. Mason's comments. I'm not clear on the level of detail of these drawings we're getting for $100,000, one. Second, I'm actually confused, David, to this whole timeline. So if you could just take one moment, at least for me, and walk me through, starting with, I guess, the meeting with the Selectmen's Committee.
Sure.
That was 5-5, you're saying. They approved IM status. MI status, sorry. So walk me through this, because I'm not clear if we're in the process of you getting MI status.
Let me answer your first question first, Mr. Pellegrino. The detail that you will find in these drawings are prescribed really by staff of planning and zoning. And in connection with this request, we've had our architects and engineers, SLAM organization out of Glastonbury, actually talk to Diane Fox, and they have agreed on what kind of drawing she needs for that purpose. Those drawings are not going to be good enough to take the project out to bid. They're not going to have the detail on mechanical, electrical, water improvements. Those really are going to have to come after you've released a much larger portion of that $1.3 million. And those will be detailed drawings that the project is bid on.
So for the $100,000, we're talking about drawings that meet planning and zoning requirements or needs.
Correct. Correct. Going back to the timetable, and if anybody's got a different understanding, why, don't hesitate to interrupt. But after the Board of Selectmen approved municipal improvement status for Project Renew, and they did that based on a PowerPoint presentation that went on at some length, some written memoranda which described the differences between the $38 million project and the $22.5 million project. They sent an application in to the Planning and Zoning Commission asking for municipal improvement status to be granted and also approval of a final site plan. I learned at about the same time your chairman did that Planning and Zoning Commission staff felt they could not act on the materials contained in the application of the Board of Selectmen for the reasons that the chairman, and we faced the risk that because the application could not be acted upon, I think Mr. Reamer is the statutory language. If the application were not acted on within 90 days of its filing, then it's deemed approved. And I think we fully agree with the notion that that's not the way to get P&Z approval of Project Renew.
If I may interrupt you for a moment?
Sure.
Can you withdraw your requests for municipal improvement?
The application has been withdrawn by the Board of Selectmen, and I sent a letter to the Board of Selectmen same date as the application was withdrawn, acquiescing in that process.
Okay, so then the 90-day period is not running any longer.
It is not running at the moment.
Tarkington.
I just, one question, David. As you describe it, planning and zoning, in addition to granting MI, would also be granting final site plan approval?
That is my understanding.
Thank you.
And these drawings will be sufficient to permit that decision.
Final site plan. So it doesn't need to go through any other agency of the town? Only planning and zoning?
Well,
Final
it
site plan.
has gone through other agencies, inlands and wetlands, but that's the last principal land hurdle, if you will.
Thank you.
Further discussion? I mean, I think to some degree, I'm conflicted. I mean, I certainly was up here and supported the freeze originally in the hopes of preventing the expenditures of any other taxpayer money on Project Renew as it was instituted from the beginning. And even before, when we had HDG come in, and we talked about what other drawings were necessary, and the numbers to get to those other drawings, at least at that time, were much larger. And I wasn't a supporter of the expenditures or the utilization of that money as well. Although I am concerned that that pushing this off even another month potentially pushes this out of what I think is already a tight cycle relative to both the town approval process as well as the MI approval process. Although I hear you, and I don't want to see unnecessary spending of money or increase in cost because of delay. But I'm less concerned about Nathaniel Witherell getting its MI. I'm more concerned about the town approval process for the bonding. So if I were to weigh those two sort of parallel tracks, I would say it's that timeline that I'm most concerned about, and I'm most concerned about not giving Nathaniel Witherell the best opportunity for success. Because ultimately, while I don't think this body is going to be a rubber stamp for Project Renew, and we're going to look at HDG's report, I think at the end of the day, the body that really needs to decide whether or not we remain in the business is for the RTM. So as I look at this, I think that information is going to be needed anyway. And so I'm more inclined, even with the lack of information or time to digest this, to move forward on this. But you know, Mr. Finger.
David, I'm still a little confused. Has the BET seen the plan that you proposed to have the architects work on for the purposes of P&Z approval?
I don't think they have, Mr. Finger. What you've had is a oral description, really, of the changes from the prior larger project to a refined or a smaller project.
And when you submitted the application for MI approval at the Board of Selectmen level, did they receive an explanation or plans as to what it was you were seeking at that time?
Well, they did receive a description of the smaller project. The PowerPoint presentation that I referred to goes into that in some detail.
But we have not seen that.
I frankly have forgotten whether we've shown you the...
So that was the presentation that we did see? Okay. That just showed kind of conceptually where administrative would be and things of that sort?
Well, we had with us architectural mock-ups of the project that was downsized, if you will, from the 38.663.
You said that you were concerned about a 3 or 4 month loss of time. If we waited until July, when the chair indicates we will likely be receiving an HDG report and might have more information available to us, and at that same time, and please, fellow board members, indulge me with this timing, if at that point we decided to move forward and allow and release the $100,000, wouldn't you only be losing 30 days?
No, that'd be July 18th that I think you're meeting with HDG. It's going to take us about 45 days to have the drawings prepared.
But if we approve that today, you still have the 45 days. We're just waiting another 30 days, so it would be, instead of 45 days from now, it would be 75 days from now. It would be 1 month as opposed to an additional 3 or 4 months, correct?
I think that's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Tarkington and Mr. Simon.
Yeah, I want to come back to the final site plan, David, because does this require notice to the neighbors? I mean, obviously, this is a different plan, and again, I'm not sure what changes would be made, but is this a situation where the neighbors get notice? Because I begin thinking about doing something now that needs to be accomplished, say, by September 15th. Neighbors tend to be away in the summertime. I mean, again, the sensitivity to abutting neighbors as well as obviously proceeding with this ourselves.
Ms. Tarkington, I haven't been personally involved in the process with the Planning and Zoning Commission. It's really been done by the Town Building Committee, which has hired Bruce Cohen to represent him at those meetings. So I can't answer whether that kind of notification has occurred. I do know that we have hosted neighborhood groups to show them the Project Renew drawings and what is likely to change from the perspective of a neighbor. And I think I'm correct in saying that there's been no neighborhood dissension or objection or criticism of the project in its present form as yet.
Thank you.
Mr. Simon, did you want to speak?
So it would be my inclination to wait 1 month, to wait until the July 18th, till we get the HDG report, till we feel more confident that this is a path we're going to go down. I think you'll have enough information to go to P&Z in September, and you'll have enough information to go to the RTM for a first reading at its September 20th meeting, and I feel relatively confident that we can try and make sure we stay within the September-October timeframe.
I don't see how we get there in September if you postpone this decision.
You may not have, I think, enough, you'll have final drawings to go to the RTM. You can go to a first reading. We will be able to vote on whatever we have to vote on in September, and you'll be able to go to P&Z and you'll be able to go to the RTM in October.
I can't get to P&Z without 45 days plus 30 days plus whatever their meeting days are scheduled for. I'd be very surprised if I could get there because cutting this as finally as we have, if you were to act this evening, I think we get there on the 13th of September, but it's by a whisker. So I'm a little surprised if we could delay this for a month and I could still get there in September.
I'm confused, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pellegrino.
Your objective is to get a municipal improvement status,
Correct.
and you feel, well, I'm going to go there, and you feel that you need to do that before you get a final vote from the RTM?
Yes.
But aren't we thinking that we're going to get a final vote from the RTM more like possibly December?
No, I think as your chairman outlined the schedule that we've talked about.
But we're going to take it up in September for a vote, so I don't know how does the RTM have a first read before we even pass on it? Is that the thought process?
The thought process, that's correct, that all the information would be before us. There would be a synergy with us taking it up on a final and the RTM taking it up on a first read, RTM not having, and I don't want to speak for the RTM, and I've conveyed that to Nathaniel Wither as well. The moderator and I have very broadly talked about this. We haven't nailed down the process, so I don't even know if they would accept it in that fashion, but that would be the goal. Once again, essentially to build in an automatic 1 month cushion. It's a 2 month cushion because there's no November meeting, but in reality, it's really only a 1 month cushion because if you falter at any of those stages, you're automatically in December.
I somewhere got the idea that your September meeting was on the 12th of September.
It is.
And the RTM meeting is on the 19th of September.
Okay,
You read the
so
calendar?
we can get it there.
But, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Raymer and then Mr. Campbell.
This is not an item on the agenda, so if I remember my parliamentary rules, it requires a 2/3 vote to take the matter up on the agenda.
That's correct, and that's why we brought it up as the discussion point, and I was clear in saying it's not the actual item yet.
So it's the purpose of the chair at some point to address the question of taking that two-thirds vote to see what the.
Mr. Raymer, thank you, yes. And so after this discussion, the feeling of this body would be, the first vote, if we were going to take it up, would be that we would need two-thirds to take it up as an item. Assuming it got to two-thirds, then we would take it up on its merits. If it did not garner the two-thirds, then obviously Nathaniel Wither would not get the appropriation. They'd in all likelihood be back next month.
Yeah, they could put it on the agenda at that point with a regular blue sheet and presentation at the July meeting.
It'll be on the agenda in July if we don't approve it.
Thank you.
Hold on, Mr. Campbell?
Yeah. Normally, I would be sympathetic to those who would like to wait, and it has come to us sort of irregularly, and time is usually a good thing for this body to consider an appropriation of $100,000. But I am somewhat persuaded that you do have a timing issue, that it is important that drawings be included ultimately in whatever the BET looks at, and certainly whatever the RTM looks at when they finally decide this issue. And so I would be in favor of moving this money tonight so that you can get these drawings to meet. I guess what you have are really several goals, or as I see them, several goals in getting the drawings. For P&Z, you'd like them sooner rather than later. I think ultimately the RTM ought to have them. I think that's what we'll probably decide in July. So I'd be comfortable in voting for them tonight.
Pellegrino.
Just haven't heard anything that tells me that by moving this 1 month, it's really going to prevent the art.
Well, I disagree with the assumption that it's just another month's delay. I can't explain it any better than I attempted to Mr. Simon, but I think it is much more likely to be 2 and possibly as much as 3 or 4 months of delay if we cannot get started on these construction drawings.
I'm going to just sort of, well, I am going to cut off debate only to the extent that I think we have a clear picture, I think, of the timing of this. To Mr. Pellegrino's point, I do think that there are situations where it might be possible to get this through this year. But I think any time that when you try to build in the delay, I think the delay that we built in would no longer be present based on our decision tonight. And I guess it all depends on whether or not you're willing to take that risk of having that no delay and then pushing this off to the following calendar year, which once again isn't the end of the world either. I just think you lose some of that institutionally on this body and on the RTM. But once again, I brought it forward because I think this has been a helpful dialogue, and if we didn't have a discussion, it would automatically be deferred to July, and I know I didn't want to make that decision. I think that's for this board to decide, and that's why it's before you.
Could I make one other observation, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
That is, there is $1.3 million which remains in unexpended funds which have been appropriated by the RTM to the purpose of construction drawings and pre-engineering analysis. When we asked last time, which I think was in February, for a release of those funds, we were asking for the full $1.3 million. This is a relatively modest amount, which is critical to getting Planning and Zoning Commission approval within as best we see it, the most timely fashion we can.
Ms. Tarkin, do you have anything to add to this?
Well, I just wanted to comment. It's my understanding that the 1,000,001, as we originally approved it, going back to 2007, was really, it was the remainder of the total of the soft costs, which were 10% of the $37 million project. So it wasn't just for pre-architectural drawings, it was, when we approved it, a total, the remainder of what would be a total of 10% of $37 million, as I remember that.
Well, the specific resolution of the RTM actually appropriated $3.6 million.
3.6.
And you're right, it was intended to cover engineering and architectural studies.
And all the detailed architectural plans and all soft costs through the conclusion of the project, as was originally approved.
Correct.
Thank you.
Ms. Barton?
As you know, I've been inclined to support the Project Renew for a long time. But what troubles me about this application is finding it on the dais when I walked in at 6:30 and listening to a somewhat disjointed discussion about what the urgent need is for the funds today as opposed to 30 days from now. And I'm still not sure I understand what you are losing by losing 30 days, because that would be my inclination, would be to wait, get it all together, and look at it and make a judgment. On the other hand, it is, quote, only $100,000. But I hesitate to try to explain to anyone that we approved only $100,000, not knowing what we were getting for it.
Well, I wish I was as convinced as you may be that this is a mere 30-day delay, or the risk is a mere 30-day delay. I think as I look at planning and zoning process and scheduled meetings, I don't see it happening in September. I think it's at best likely to go on, and maybe we get it there in October.
Okay. So I would apologize for the timing of this, except for the fact that I only knew about it on Friday. With that, is there a motion, just so that we can, again, move things to a vote, is there a motion to take up what we have a blue sheet on, which is NW4?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Norton, second by Mr. Raymer, only because he had his hand up. Further discussion on the item to take up, NW4. Remember, it's not on the merits, it's on taking the matter up. Mr.
I'm sorry. I'm
Taking the matter up, simply getting NW4 then to a vote on its substance. Needs a 2/3 majority, as Mr. Raymer has indicated. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? No. 2 noes? So 3, 8, 3, 0?
That's enough.
What's that?
That's enough.
That's enough, right? So the item now, NW4, is before us. Mr. Norton?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move to authorize the spending of $100,000 from account B45059580 for design work, preliminary design work for Project Renew.
It's been moved by Mr. Norton.
Second.
Second by Mr. Campbell. A further discussion? Mr. Mason?
RTM Special Committee, 6 years. We're down to a 30-day window on a set of drawings that we probably would do either way. I've obviously, from my point of view, scrutinized the project right from the get-go. This is, to me, we're going to need this information, even if we had the HD report sitting in front of us. I do agree with Nathaniel Witherell. They have an authorization to spend, although some could say maybe that some of that might have lapsed by now as per charter. But even with that said, this 1 month is not going to make a difference. We're into this project for far more than $100,000. Please don't misunderstand that. I think $100,000 is a lot of money, but I think it's on this particular one. This is information that will be needed by us. It'll be needed by the RTM. The current drawings we have are for a different project, so I would hope this. And if I just to clarify the timeline, because I do see that 5/5 was the MI date, which has been pulled, which would have expired 8/5. 7/11, 7/2011, the BET gets HDG report. 8/11, somewhere in there, the drawings would be complete. My guess, according to what you're saying, somewhere in the month of August, these drawings would be available.
August 13.
August 13th. Mid-September, you would do the MI with,
Planning and zoning.
Planning and zoning?
At their scheduled September 13 meeting.
at our scheduled September meeting, you would come before us. We would in turn give the RTM a first crack at it in September at their meeting is the end of the month. And then if it got through us, they'd have a first read, and then this would set us up for October. The RTM does not have a cycle in November, so if we do miss this, we do push it right to December.
Correct.
Is that an accurate calendar?
That's an accurate calendar.
Thank you.
May I thank Mr. Mason for laying out that calendar? Thank you.
Well, I had to write it because it was going back and forth.
Further discussion on the calendar or
Write it down.
A motion.
All right.
Mr. Finger?
So we're talking about $100,000 for finalizing a site plan, correct? And doing more? The construction plan.
Correct.
We're going to get an HDG report in July. We don't know what that report's going to say. It's either going to be ambiguous in terms of, whether the report totally endorses Project Renew or not. Or it may say Project Renew looks like on its merits it's going to be successful. Or it may say, with uncertainty with Medicare and other things, Project Renew, we think, is going to cost the town X million dollars a year. So we're going to spend, if we approve this, $100,000 to get to construction plans on a plan that a report is going to be, and we're going to receive a report in 30 days that may influence significantly what we do. I still don't see, notwithstanding Mr. Mason's illustration of a timeline, I'm not sure that from my perspective, that it's a worthwhile expenditure today as opposed to 30 days from now. We're talking about $100,000. In the scope of things, it's not a large number, but $100,000 is a large number. I mean, we cut that from different department budgets all the time, and we have debates. I'm still not, for me, there's too much uncertainty out there to cause me to decide to vote on something today that I can vote on 30 days from now.
Mr. Pellegrino?
Bill, I hear what you're saying. The problem I'm faced with is, I'm not sure that this is the right body to vote Project Renew, revised Project Renew down, candidly. I think this is.
Vote it
this is the
down.
right body to vote it down.
We're having trouble with the mic.
I think this is an institution, and I really think it's up to the RTM to make this decision whether we're going. Absolutely try to quantify costs and taxes. What this project. My sense is such disarray that there are questions that help us. Probably still have this very same discussion. Yes. Range to what the real burden is. I think if we do our job, it's to do the very best we can to explain to the public what we think is going to be the real burden financially on the operating budget, on our capital budget going forward. And that said, what this really boils down to is, do we try to make sure we're going to meet a deadline for this RTM and this BET to make a final decision on it this year or not? Whether or not this is good money after bad or bad money after good, I don't know. But I think right now I'll probably go ahead and say, go ahead and give them $100,000.
Mr. Norton, and then I'll come back this end.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the reason I made the motion is I do not think it's our responsibility. We should be being an obstacle to having this project go forward. It seems to me that if we're going to be in this business, it should be the legislative body that makes that decision. And I think that we have to facilitate it so that the legislative body can have as much information to proceed as to whether or not they remain in the business. So that I think by appropriating $100,000, we provide the facility so that they are able to take it to the step where the RTM, the legislative body, can make the decision as to whether or not this is something which the town of Greenwich should provide.
Mr. Finger.
I agree, and I stand corrected. I didn't mean to suggest that this body should be making a decision to approve or turn down Project Renew. I stand corrected, and if that's what I said, I did not intend those words to come from my mouth. However, I think the HDG report is an important report because it could give us an indication that maybe the mix of rooms or the mix of uses, whether it be more rehab or less rehab or more long-term nursing rooms versus fewer long-term nursing rooms, may significantly or materially impact, and correct me if I'm wrong, David, could impact what Project Renew looks like. And if we would have spent $100,000 because we couldn't wait 30 days, that could be $100,000 out the window, or a good portion of that, because now maybe it's, well, there should be more rehab rooms or there should be less. That's what I meant. And again, my personal opinion is that we can wait 30 days before we spend the $100,000. And I'm not opposed to spending the $100,000. I'm just inclined not to support spending the $100,000 today with the information that we don't have.
So I'm going to vote for it because when I listen to the discussion, I listen to the timeline. You're going to need every possible day. I think the most important thing is to make sure that this Project Renew is either decided this year, one way or the other. I agree with the chairman's comment that you have a lot of people involved, both on the BET and on the RTM, that have institutional knowledge that have been involved with this project. Going beyond December into January would be very expensive for the town if we went ahead. I'm also not convinced that we're going to know enough in July to make a different decision than we are tonight, even though, clearly if HDG comes back on July 18th and says there's no way this is a feasible project to do, I think then we would just make some different decisions and we would share that with you and have a discussion. And I don't think they're coming back, and they're not supposed to come back and say you should have more rehab beds and fewer long-term beds. They're supposed to either validate the assumptions or not. So despite my original reluctance to vote for this, I'm going to vote for it now that we've taken it up. Because I think the timetable is the most important part of this discussion.
Ms. Tarkington, and then Ms. Barton, and then I think Mr. Gortney's going to call the question. Ms. Tarkington.
Yeah, again, I came in here fully expecting to vote for this. But again, Mr. Ormsby, I guess what concerns me is what, you now told us that this is going to final site plan, a change of plans, a change, again, you're not going to get the drawings until you've shared with us till August 13th, and then P&Z will approve this on September 13th, which is only 1 week after Labor Day. I would just hope that, again, the timing is such that it makes me a little uncomfortable. I don't know if they meet every 2 weeks, but to give the neighbors a little bit more time when they're apt to be around, to me, would make more sense than covering this in the month of August, again, not having the plans available until August 13th, and then going to P&Z on September 13th. This is something, a hurdle that I didn't understand when I came in. I was thinking more in terms, as my colleagues were, about, the BET and the RTM. But as many know, I've always had concern for our neighborhoods, and, this too was a neighborhood, and I think keeping the neighbors fully informed is also important in this case. I don't know, again, if there's a middle, P&Z seems to, meet every couple of weeks. I don't know if it'd be possible to delay this until a little later in September, just so that there is that opportunity for.
I don't want to leave the audience here with the impression that you've suggested that the neighbors have not been fully informed. We have held open houses for the neighbors. If you looked at the prior plans for the larger version, it is almost indistinguishable from a sightline point of view with the smaller version of Project Renew. The real activity that goes on happens inside the building. It's mechanical, it's engineering, it's repairing elevators, it's sprinklering the administrative building. We're not suddenly constructing towers or wings on the building that really have an effect on neighbors. While I appreciate their right to be involved, and have gone out of our way to try and keep them informed all the way along, and many of them have taken advantage of that. We've held open houses for them. We've shown them architectural renderings, albeit of the prior building, but from a visual point of view, there's very little change in the smaller project.
So generating units and all those cogen, whatever it is, there aren't going to be any changes that would cause any issues?
There is no cogen unit in the $22.5 million project.
Thank you.
Ms. Martin?
I think this project is highly unlikely to be ready for final approvals this year. Maybe that's just because I'm a pessimist, and it is what it is. I, too, having listened to the presentations, mainly the arguments of this board as opposed to an orderly presentation from Nathaniel Witherall, is I don't want to stand in the way of what could conceivably be progress. I'm not positive that it will be, but I will vote for the motion. What I wanted to say separately, though, is a couple of members of this board have suggested that it is not this board's role to pass on whether we should do Project Renew at the end of the day. And I say it is most emphatically our role in the first instance to make that judgment and pass it along, if appropriate, to the RTM, who can agree or not. Individual members can go ahead and vote for whatever reason they want, yes or no. But as an institution, the BET has the charter responsibility to make an affirmative decision about whether this project should go forward and adopt the necessary resolutions and bonding and so forth if we agree with that. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Mr. Gortney, are you calling the question? All right.
Never give up his place in line.
We're taking up Mr. Gortney and Mr. Mynarski's evaluations next month, so just remember Mr. Gortney's acceptance of taking this matter up first when you looking at his evaluation. Okay. So it's been moved by Mr. Norton, second by Mr. Campbell. Wait, do I have that right? No, that was for the taking the matter up.
No, to authorize the extent.
All right. So am I right? Norton, Campbell, on the merits?
Norton Reamer. Norton Reamer on the merits.
Mr. Norton Campbell. No. My motion was
She's
to
right.
spend the authors.
Yes.
My motion was
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. Okay. Motion is now before us for approval to use $100,000 for, now does it go to the building committee? Or is it to Nathaniel Witherell? It's to the building committee, correct? Okay. Okay. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Nay. 2. 9 to 0, Mr. Raymer and Mr. Finger. For the reasons articulated previously. All right.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Normally, after such a long, lengthy discussion, there are less questions, but we'll see. Item 4 now comes before us. Our town assessor and the assistant assessor, Bob Shipman, Ted Courtney. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the Board of Estimate and Taxation. You have my report in front of you. I just want to make 3 kind of highlights of it. Item 2 talks about the Superior Court case filings. And as of this afternoon, we've had 35 filings of cases in the Superior Court over the 2010 revaluation. My second point is that the senior and firefighter tax relief programs, the work is substantially done on them, and we're reporting 800 qualified applicants for the local senior credit. The estimated cost is $906,000 for the senior tax relief and $43,000 for the volunteer firefighter credit. And the third point is that the tax bills, as you know, were mailed last Friday, and we are experiencing the people coming in. It's been very busy at our office today, and I expect it will be for the next several weeks in answering questions about the tax bills. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have.
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Martin and Mr. Norton.
Is the cost of the local credit programs under budget, the projected cost?
I believe that it's slightly under budget. I don't remember.
Slightly under? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
It sounds like it's $1,000 over that we budgeted 905.
905 include the fire.
It's 906.
Like 50,000.
Lucky guess.
Mr. Chairman, the question I have involves the litigation. Do I read this correctly, Ted, that there have been 5 additional cases filed since you wrote this report?
Yes, that's correct.
Further questions? Moved by Ms. Tarkington. Second by Mr. Finger. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention? 11-0-0. Thank you. Item 5 now comes before us, the Comptroller's Report.
Good evening. I was going to report that the tax bills went out last Friday, and I got mine on Saturday. I can tell you that we've already collected, as of today, $800,000 in prepayments. So when you get your tax collection review analysis next month, which showed the sharp drop in the tax collections, you're going to see a very favorable report. Secondly, I was going to give you an HTG update, but I think we've covered that. But I would like to further answer Jeff's concern. I did get an email a couple weeks ago. A major contributor to the report, Mary Nell Zellner. If you recall, last year the 2 presenters were Tom Stitt and Mary Nell Zellner. She decided to take a 4-week vacation in the middle of the report, and she's not due back until July 5th. And where the chairman was a little hesitant, and I have some hesitancy. I have been promised that the report will be ready for the month of July, but that's the reason why there was an anticipated delay. A key player, and they don't have many of them, took 4 weeks off in the middle of the report. And thirdly, the report, the study for the HR study is moving along, and hopefully that will also be completed for September. I will answer any further questions you may have in the report.
Mr. Finger?
It's not a question, it's just a comment and maybe an observation with regard to the tax collection review analysis report. As I think many of us know, several years ago, this report was included in the controller's report for the first time, essentially as a result of some questions and a suggestion that I had made. I think it's outlived its usefulness. It doesn't really tell us a whole lot, particularly since Peter indicated that the next month's report is going to show $800,000 of receivables for next fiscal year. So we'll see over 100% collection, and it doesn't give us the information that it was originally intended to provide. It was originally intended to kind of give us a snapshot as to whether we were being negatively affected by the economic crisis of 2007, 2008. We can argue whether it did or it didn't, but I personally think it's outlived its usefulness, and I don't think the Controller's Office needs to spend the time in preparing this report for us every month.
Are you suggesting we shelve it?
That is my suggestion.
I'd second it.
Okay, so that's fine. I mean, if this body doesn't wish to have that information, or more importantly, if they'd like to see it in a different format or with different information present, then my only hesitation is not that we don't go forward with that, but then it requires somebody to take the first stab at that and then follow up. Mr. Finger.
I'll add one other thing. The schedule that's entitled Town of Greenwich Cash Forecast, I think is a better document for us to understand where we are in terms of our cash flows and cash needs. And I think, again, having the benefit of the cash forecast report is further evidence of the fact that the tax collection review analysis report is not necessary.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Campbell, were you first? And then...
Yeah, does it take much time for your office, Peter, to prepare this?
This report, absolutely not. The bulk of the work is done, obviously, by the tax collector. If I could follow up, I could still report to the investment committee of the BET. Mm-hmm. And if there's a trend that's unusual, I can include it in my report.
That makes probably more sense.
Mr. Chairman, that's exactly what I was going to recommend. The investment committee next meets on the same day in which we meet at 9:30 in the morning, following the OPEB advisors meeting. And I was going to suggest that it be referred to the investment committee, and we can make any modifications and changes, or possibly even combine the two reports and make a report to the
There you have it.
full
We'll call it the finger rule or something. All right, is there a motion to approve the comptroller's report?
So moved.
Oh, Ms. Tarkington?
I had one question, Mr. Minarski. This section in the beginning on the retirement board, the discussion of an ad hoc cost of living adjustment, a call for retirees, is that something that was initiated by whom, and what's your view on this? This is the first I sort of have heard about this.
This is, I don't know the whole history going back decades, but periodically the retirement board would approve ad hoc cost of living adjustment COLAs for retirees. And I believe in 2005, the RTM took offense to the actions of the retirement board. And subsequent to that, there was not an investigation, but a thorough examination of how they got to where they were and why they did what they did. And they issued a report. And subsequent also, Alcala decided to incorporate it into the contracts. And this particular COLA applies to the non-contractual retirees. So, I mean, beyond that, it's something that's done on an ad hoc basis, except for after 2005, now it's in a number of the contracts.
So is this something, before it's done on an ad hoc basis, that goes back either to our board or to the RTM? Or how is that handled?
So, first of all, no one's proposed an ad hoc increase.
No, there's a discussion here, that's why I brought it up.
Some of the members of the retirement board asked to have a discussion of the cost of the ad hoc increase. The retirement board would first have to approve it, and then the BET would have to approve it. And it doesn't go beyond the BET.
Thank you.
But the reason we haven't had one in a long time is that we're trying to make all the unions accept the COLA.
So now, Mr. Chairman, I would move that we accept the controller's report.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington. Second. Second by Mr. Pellegrino. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstention, 11-0-0. Is there a motion to approve the treasurer's report?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to make a motion to approve, but I also reserve the right to speak on
Okay, moved by Mr. Norton.
it. Second.
Second by Mr. Pellegrino. Mr. Norton.
I'd like to address on this report, which is very extensive and has been modified the last couple of months. So we delineate the OPEB trust, the amount of funds that are in the OPEB trust, which is showing $22,203,000. I just want to bring it to the attention of the board that between now and the end of this month, between 1.4 and 1.7 will be withdrawn from the OPEB trust to pay the due tos which are due back to the town, and that sum of money will then be deposited into the general fund of the town. So that the OPEB trust actually, in effect, is going to be reduced by approximately $1.5 million between now and the end of the year.
Thank you. Further discussion on the treasurer's report? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, abstention, 11-0-0. Items 7, 8, and 9 now come before us. Those are the committee special liaison reports. Discussion. Hearing none. Moving on to item 10, the chairman's report. So, the one major piece of information that I have to share, we've taken up Project Renew, obviously, but is I've received correspondence from vendors regarding energy and the cost of energy for the town. And in accepting those correspondence, there has certainly I've been involved in the discussions. I know that vendors have reached out to Mr. Mason, the first selectman's office, and in my own mind, the real thought was, and the request was to actually meet with the BET. And so, when I first heard this, I thought that might be a viable option. But upon further review, I'm not sure that the proper venue is. It would be better if these vendors went back to purchasing and/or the first selectman's office to then issue a report. I don't like necessarily saying that, because I think when people come up with good ideas, you get bounced around from first selectman's office to the BET to finance to the chairman of the budget committee to maybe myself, maybe one of you have received these same calls. So I'm generally reluctant to push off somebody who actually calls us up and says they have an efficiency for the town that we can potentially save money. But I'm not sure that we're the appropriate body to accept a vendor from out of the blue, even if it's for informational purposes, to accept it. And I think somebody suggested to me that it sets a bad precedent, and I think that's the way I'm looking at this. Not because it wouldn't be a good informational session, and I will share with you the information that I've received electronically. But I do think that we're not the right body, and we're criticized often for micromanaging certain areas of town. But I do think that we should act on it and be responsive to people who contact us. So what I would like to do, and I'm just more looking for either a nod of the head or making sure that I'm not crazy in my approach, is that I would like to take in particular this one vendor and request of purchasing with, I think they're going to need DPW's help, in just to review what their submission is. Once again, not for awarding of a contract. Obviously, that's an RFP process and whatever else. But I would like to know what our options are relative to the cost of energy. And I don't think we've received that type of analysis any time in the recent past. And so maybe it's worthwhile to look at that again and whether purchasing needs the assistance of DPW or not. But then to report back sometime between now and February of next year, which gives them plenty of time to look at available options and yet be responsive to people who come before us.
That's all not our head.
Fair enough. All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. As you can tell, I'm a little conflicted with this, is trying to be responsive and yet understanding our role versus the other agencies of the town.
You know, I think there is an energy task force within the town of people that go, that evaluate different energy bids.
Are there? Is there?
I think Bob Brady.
No, but there's a group, there's John Sullivan, John Gray, somebody for the Board of Ed that sits there and evaluates and goes through this, and that would be the appropriate place
Perfect.
to send them.
So let's kick this can down the road. And I don't. I just want someone to look at it because I think that there are good ideas out there, ideas that are outside the box, and whether this town can benefit from that or not remains to be seen. But finance, I will, Roland, I'll send you the information that I have. And if you can just say that I'm requesting of this committee and find out who's on it, and I'll correspond with them directly if I need to. The only thing else that I have to report on is I'm still trying to keep on this agenda that we have for the remainder of the year. This was always going to be a big meeting. July, though, is looking to be another lengthy meeting. We hopefully will have the HDG report. We hopefully will have the evaluations of the comptroller and the assessor. We will have, after tonight, hopefully the vote on the policies and procedures. And the one item that I would like to have voted on tonight, but now will be pushed to July, will be hopefully the vote on the debt policy, which we'll get to in a second, very briefly. So July looks full. The plan still is to have no August meeting and then come back in September, the big one being Nathaniel Witherell, and then you heard whether or not some of the other MISA contracts are here, and also to the Budget Committee will be starting their guidelines. So we've got a lot of busy months, but enjoy August. Okay. Item 11 now comes before us, old business, the first item we've taken up. The second item, the debt and fund balance policy. I had asked Roland to provide us with a presentation, which I guess he's starting. While he's doing that, I'm going to jump if I can. I don't think this is necessarily out of order as he's warming that up. This is the first reading of the BET policies and procedures. So obviously we don't have the same discussion twice, but I did want to get this and have people focus their attention on the policies and procedures manual. I would encourage everyone, especially with their wordsmithing, to please try to have that in as soon as possible, as there may be some substantive discussions that we need to take up next month. And I'd rather not have to deal with whether it should be an and or an or, because I think for the most part, we have a tendency to agree with one another on those ands or ors, and it just makes sense to do, and it was an oversight of the original drafters. Not that they have made any mistakes, but if they did, we usually try to correct them quickly. So with that, I would say to you, please don't wait until the week before to then start reviewing this. It's really before us tonight. And I would ask that you give it, and if you have a substantive question, the goal too would be to try to get it to me as soon as possible. That way we can start framing the discussion for next month. Mr. Raymer.
Is it the chair's thought that this policy and procedures manual would be dealt with by this BET? I have, speaking just for myself, I have some ill ease with the notion of a BET setting policy and procedures for the BET that follows. I'd rather, this late in the year, see the policy and procedures adopted by the new BET and then be governed by it over the 2 years of their term that follows. That seems somehow more agreeable to me than the idea that the hand from the grave, we have a departing chair, etc. I like, there's a piece that disquiets me a little about the that we'll cast policy and procedure for those who follow.
It is my intention to move this forward this term. At the January meeting of 2012, that body will then be able to pick this up and vote for it or not. I think the alternative to voting it this year would be to have brand-new members without any experience take this up without having any of the institutional knowledge of the members who are leaving take up a 50-page document or however many pages it is. And I think they'll have that opportunity, but they'll also have the wisdom of a prior board, as every other board has in the past with the policies. This is not essentially a new policies and procedures, although it's completely revamped. It's based on a foundation that was approved by several prior boards earlier. And so we are going to take it to a vote this term, and the next board can either accept it or reject it at its January of 2012 board meeting. Okay. So that's, unless there are other comments on the policies and procedures at this point, once again, minor comments, grammatical comments as soon as possible, but also equally important, substantive questions regarding what the policies and procedures manual did, group did. The earlier the better, so that we can start framing the conversation. Okay. Item 11, old business, Greenwich debt and fund balance policy discussion. I had asked Mr. Geiger, based on what I thought was the productive conversation at the Budget Committee regarding defining what is debt. And at the end of that discussion, although there was no formal vote taken, I thought the general consensus was, at least of the BET members present and engaged in the conversation, was that debt, at least for the purposes of the policy as what's going to be presented to both the Audit and the Budget Committee next month, was going to include all debt. And then there was a follow-up conversation about, okay, if it really was all debt, where are we, especially relative to the ceiling that is on the draft policy of $200 million. So Roland, with that, let me turn it over to you for a brief presentation.
This is the capital plan that's in the current budget, in the 11-12 budget. And just as what we kind of agreed upon last week, debt in this case is all the debt that we have. This plan only has really two limitations on it. One is the tax levy stays in the order that it's presented, going up $3 million a year. And the other limitation is that we can't borrow for things like debt repayment. So those are really the only two limits on this model here. And we can see that we exceed the $200 million limit in 2 years. We're $206 million, and we go up to $276 million.
In year 15-16.
Right, in year 15-16. The next one shows what we have to do if we want to adhere to the...
Hold on, and that, just so it's crystal clear, and that assumes, talk about below the line, the projects to be prioritized.
Oh, well, those are still in the budget. But these are just identified as projects that are more discretionary than others. To get this model to work within the limits that I just spoke about, we still have to defer $43 million of projects over the next 6 years.
Well, I'm not understanding that, I'm sorry.
That's right.
Oh.
If we go back to the top here.
I'm sorry, Roland. The projects, Mr. Chairman, may I speak?
Please.
Sorry.
Yep, and then Mr. Finger.
The projects that you're showing as projects to be prioritized.
Yes.
You are saying that those projects are in the figures above?
They are.
In the years in which they were shown here?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
But there's also a pullout of 43.
You can see, if we go to the top, those projects that are discretionary are in what's called adjusted capital. But to make the model work, for example, in 13-14, we have to pull out $11 million of projects. And you can pick which ones you think they should be.
But the pullout of $11 million, to use your example in 13-14, is a pullout out of the, casting right at the bottom now, out of the $38,750,000. We have to pull 11 out to make that model work.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Finger?
When you say make the model work, make it work,
Within the two constraints, one is that the mill rate doesn't increase any more than it does year over year.
which is, and what did we establish, 2.87?
$3 million a year.
When you say the mill rate, you mean the general,
The tax levy. Right.
Okay.
And the other constraint
other
is
one.
we can't borrow to pay debt.
All right, everybody clear? I know Mr. Pellegrino then has a question, but so far, so good? All right, Mr. Pellegrino.
Okay, Roland, I'd like you to explain to me the projects to be prioritized. If we just start with fiscal year 12-13, what are you telling me here with these projects that you've listed? Are these, specifically, are these the only projects where money could be taken from, and that therefore every single item that's a placeholder is already spoken for?
The other projects that are left are, I think, projects that most of us would agree are in the form of maintenance. This would be paving, the boilers, the roofs, things like that.
Okay, so I want to go back to my question. You're telling me that every other project that's in the capital budget right now as it stands for 12-13 is essentially projects that we would not take money from, and that these are the only projects that we could conceivably take money
Well,
from?
the big one in 12-13, of course, is the back end of MISA.
Well, no, we're doing MISA, so let's not go
Right.
there.
No, that's
Right. All right, and the same holds true for 13-14 and 14 and 15? Again, these are the only projects that we can take capital from.
Well, but that's, you could.
I think that's an overstatement. I think what this is as the finance department looks at the capital plan and plugs in routine maintenance such as street maintenance, Board of Ed routine maintenance at a set rate that the BET at least, I don't want to get into policies because they're not in every BET, to Mr. Raymer's point, has the ability to move the pieces on the chessboard. But these are the most obvious in terms of not being deemed as maintenance items.
Fair enough. I just wanted to make sure we were all clear on that, and then certainly that I was clear on that. And the second question is, the third line down in the model where it has the total for the capital projects, which now is the adjusted capital less the back out of capital. Historically, what's the high water mark that we've ever had in terms of capital projects for that line? Isn't it in the $15 million range? Is it? 54 million?
it had to be pretty high when we had
We had that 1 year of 78.
we had Glenville in there and the Central
So we had a
Firehouse.
high water mark in the $70 million range 1 year, but otherwise, in general, where's it run? About $50 million?
You know, it's been trending upwards, but it's spiked by these large projects that drop in.
If I were to ask the question a different way, if you go back to three questions I'd have. One, maintenance to maintain the Board of Ed, the school's property, runs around $10 million a year?
That's a reasonable number.
Okay. Cost to maintain the town properties excluding the Board of Ed runs about $15 million a year?
Probably with highway.
Think that's low?
Yes.
You think it's closer to 20?
We have $2 million in vehicles.
All right, so to maintain our property, assume $30 million a year. So what we're really saying is to take on new projects, we have capacity of 20 to 25 million a year if we want to maintain a limit, let's say, of $200 million.
I think that's right.
Yeah, $30 million a year just in maintenance.
I just want to get at that. Okay, thank you.
So that's, sure. All right, this kind of lays on the $200 million total debt limit onto the capital model. And what this requires to make it work, without changing the tax levy for capital, we need to defer $140 million over the next 6 years.
But you need to add that this assumes that we build Nathaniel Witherall.
Yes, it assumes Nathaniel Witherall. It also assumes that we're going to go steady state on sewer improvement of $8 to $10 million a year.
Was Nathaniel Wither on page one?
Yes,
In the out years, you had Nathaniel Wither in page one.
yes.
Roland, just help me. So you say 140 million over those 5 years. On page one, you already showed about 40 million coming out. So is the impact of the debt policy
Would be another $100 million.
is 100 million? That's the impact of the debt policy.
And then you can,
Of the $200 million
That's right.
debt policy is 100 million. And your projects to be prioritized that you show over a 5-year period, you show approximately $130 million here.
that's right.
So you're saying that only 30 million of that 130 million could be funded over those 5 years, all other things being equal. That's what you're showing here. If we were to meet the 200 million.
No. How much is the adjusted projects line?
140 million.
So all of the projects would have to be deferred and an additional $8 million of.
Oh, but
infrastructure.
so I go back to my first question. Why is the adjusted projects line on page one, what does that mean? That totals 40 million.
That's just the projects that have to be deferred
To-
to get within the constraints of mill rate increasing.
And
$3
you
million a year.
haven't, I see. And none of that's been,
And we-
I won't use the right language probably, but that hasn't been adjusted.
No, no,
So
it
even on page one, there has to be an adjustment from the projects to be prioritized, 40 million out of the 130. Now, if we go to page two and we have to meet the $200 million overall debt limit, then you're going to do away with the entire 130, and as Mr. Simon says, we need to find another 10. Got it. Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Finger.
Going back, sorry, page one, the mill rate that we're using is what? Is it 3.0 or?
I'm sorry, it's the
not the mill
tax
rate.
levy.
It's a capital tax
okay.
levy.
That's what we're taxing for. I keep saying mill rate, but it's just the tax levy that we use for capital projects, or capital.
Because, if I may, I'm sorry, the capital tax levy is the only number in the whole budget for the town that has anything to do with the mill rate, because we have borrowings, we have, commitments and whatever.
But the tax levy number that we have in here, isn't that tied to a larger model that we've done that projected overall town mill rate?
Correct.
So the tax levy numbers that increase by $3 million a year, that contributes to a mill rate of what?
It's about a 1% increase year over year, just that
It's about
increase.
1% of the growth of the budget.
A 1% total town budget increase?
Mill rate increase.
If you look at the mill rate increase.
Okay, mill rate increase, okay.
Typically, let's just use an easy number of 3%. About 2% of the mill rate increase goes towards the operating and fixed charges, 1% goes towards the capital tax levy.
And that's been
As a general rule. As a general rule.
The mill rate that would be, the overall mill rate increase to the taxpayer is what?
It would be about 1%, so if.
No. This year, we had a mill rate increase, putting aside, the reval, was 2.87%. Going forward, are we assuming a 2.87% increase per year, a 3% increase per year, or 2.5?
Yeah, I think it would be a premature question. You back into the number based in part on this capital model. So the model said 3 million a year every year, right? In absolute dollar amounts, that 3 million stays steady, right? So it's going to be a decrease in a percentage basis. And then you're working your model out on the operating side to adjust it accordingly.
Okay,
So
but hasn't our tax levy increased by we're limiting it to $3 million because we don't want our overall mill rate to be
Because we
increased
felt in the
beyond.
general guideline, you're in that 2 to 4 range with
Okay.
a 3 million increase each time.
Okay, so we're working within the 2 to 4% increase. Okay, I got
That's
it.
at least where the original 3 million came from.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that was the case.
All right, so we're on the second page. Can we turn now to the third page?
Okay, the third page kind of shows what the other restraint was, and that was limiting the amount that we would pay for debt service to 70% of our tax levy for capital. And that becomes very restrictive. And,
In 1 year, right?
you know, you can see that by 16-17, we would have to increase the tax levy by $10 million. And almost 10 the next year, 13 year after.
Question.
Mr. Pellegrino.
Roland, I noticed that on this page, you use the first page model. Does it make a difference if you use the second page model?
Well, it would, because you can fix the problem either by deferring capital or by increasing the mill rate in this, or the tax levy. And in this model, we're showing the impact on the tax levy. Right, this is taking kind of the 11-12 budget, capital budget, and saying what happens if we limit it to 70% of the tax levy. That's right. Well, in 14-15, we bump up against it, even if we don't have any additional borrowings after this year.
Okay. Are there further discussion points? Because this item, I know we've now taken it up, I think, 2 months here. We're now going to take it up a third month next month. It'll go back to the audit and the budget committee, both for, now that at least my sense was that we're going to use total debt as our benchmark, although I'll wait to see what comes back. But hopefully there is some building of consensus going forward between audit and budget, and then we'll take this up in July. But I hope not only because of the budget committee discussion, but tonight's discussion, people have a better understanding of what the impact will be to some of these limitations. And I think that's what we were trying to get, is a real feel for what any of the limits would be toward the capital model as it relates to projects. Mr. Raymer.
I don't know how this gets best approached. At the Budget Committee the other night, somebody was banting around the idea of having a workshop. I don't know if that's a useful idea. I certainly, if Mr. Norton has no objection, I certainly think it would be a good idea of trying to express to the body that any or all of the members who might be available to come to the Audit Committee, it would be a welcome forum to be having a dialogue, not just among the four of us who are on the Audit Committee. And so, too, if Mr. Mason doesn't mind, I would welcome the idea of seeing members of this body show up at the Budget Committee meeting, and perhaps Mr. Mason to be welcoming of dialogue from the non-Budget Committee members, because I feel somehow those are the kinds of forums at which we could probably get to the bottom of some of these things and reach some answers. Failing that, maybe the workshop idea that somebody was throwing out isn't a bad idea, but I think it's easier to work at a group like that than it is a rather formal-looking panel like this.
Just so I've never quite understood the notion of a workshop. And the reason I say that is we work through a committee structure, and I think in part, although this wasn't the original reason to work through that, was you have FOI requirements. So I'm not sure what the difference of a workshop versus a meeting is, although I guess you could argue we could have a workshop of the full board and simply sit around the table as opposed to the dais and call it a workshop as opposed to a meeting. But at the end of the day, you still have a meeting. And so I think, though, your suggestion is spot on in terms of those who are truly interested and have an opinion. I'd prefer them to start with Mr. Norton's committee and the audit committee and/or the budget committee. And I think in those environments, you've seen that there have been healthy discussions. And so I think within our committee structure, we still have that available, and I think it behooves us to all go to them on this topic to the extent there's going to be any change.
Mr. Chairman, the schedule is budget on the 12th, and we're on the audit on the 14th.
And so budget looks like it's going to get the first crack at it, or for the last time. And if you're interested, then you should attend and hopefully make your opinion known beforehand so it can help facilitate the discussion again. Ms. Tarkington.
Yeah, I just want to make it clear here that while we keep talking about borrowing and so forth, unborrowed money that's being taxed for capital. And this increases, depending on which of these pages of the model we're looking at, to $47 to $50 million, per year that we're putting into capital that we aren't borrowing. So, just using the $3 million number, I wasn't sure if it was clear to the public how much we're really putting into capital that we aren't using debt funds for. I just want to make that point.
Mr. Mason and then Ms. Barton.
I can speak with Mr. Norton. Going back to the workshop, this is we need to have a meeting on this. This is to understand the capital model going forward, you need to put projects in, you need to, at the end of each year, tonight we elapsed, $2.2 million in capital. So what that model doesn't show is that $2.2 million of capital went back into the budget for future appropriations or less borrowings. You need to work the model. That's the reason we need to have a sit down and be able to show the impacts of the model. This model takes into consideration projects that are just there and are just put in one particular budget. It has no new initiatives in it. It doesn't have any overruns for any of the current projects. It has an anticipated borrowing rate on the cash that we borrow and the payback and the schedule on that. It is a very difficult thing. This year during the budget process, we spent great lengths of time at this. If Mr. Norton and our chairman gives us the okay, I can look towards a special, we can call it budget committee, we can call it audit. I'm indifferent to sit down. But when you do that, you have to have this document working so you can see the impacts of just moving out these projects. Because otherwise, it's just a snapshot of an idea at the time we pass the budget. And that's what makes it a challenge. There's a lot going into this working document, the capital tax levy. It can be varied a little bit. There's many alternatives to doing this, including deferring projects, but I think that's what we need to do. So if it's okay with you, Mr. Chair, I'll start working on a date for that.
Well, sure, I would just say it's the budget committee meeting, and people can attend, and that's when this quote-unquote workshop will take place. We have it on the agenda. The agenda for July appears to be light, so once again, people can attend that meeting, and we can just have it then. Ms. Barton.
I've made this request before, but I find it very difficult to conceive of voting on a policy when we don't have it written down. And I'm curious, what we have right now is the draft, the original draft that was circulated May 3rd, I think was the date of it. Yeah. And none of the changes, whether logistical and typographical or substantive, have been made. No one has yet attempted to draft what could be as short as one sentence definition of debt so that we know what's in and what's out. And without having an opportunity to review that, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to take a knowledgeable vote in the next month. Someone has to be put in charge of that. I don't know who is in charge of it, but someone has to pick up a pen and get cracking.
Congratulations, Nancy. It's you.
No, I'm not on either of those two committees, so.
Well, the document that you're referencing is the document that was approved by the Budget Committee at the very least. Whether it's in artful wording or otherwise, it is the operative document. I do agree with you that many of the changes that have been suggested are grammatical in nature, and that should be done, and we should have a document that is grammatically accurate. But some of the substantive changes will have to wait until this body resolves it, or can be resolved at the Budget Committee next month and then forwarded on to the Audit Committee. Your suggestion that there is a definition of debt put in there, I think, is a good one, and I will ask Finance in the draft that gets sent to the Budget Committee to simply put in there in an appropriate place a 1 or 2 line sentence that defines debt so that everybody's clear, and the Budget Committee at the very least will take that item up. Further questions or discussions on this item? Okay. Roland, thank you. I think, once again, it's a matter of making progress so that we can move the ball down the road.
I find these exhibits that Roland does very informative. I mean, for me, these things gel as a penny drops for the first time when I'm seeing that, and I wanted to thank Roland once again. That's very critical.
Good. The only unfortunate thing about using this machine, and I don't know, maybe IT can look at this, is when you at channel 79, you can't pick it up, it doesn't show up. And so maybe there's a situation where we can run it straight to their cameras or something, so that they're looking at that screen as opposed to us talking about a screen that they can't see. Okay, item 13 now comes before us. Can I have a motion to accept the meeting minutes for May 12, 2011? Moved by Ms. Tarkington, second by Mr. Raymer. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, abstention, 11-0-0. Sorry, 10-0-1. And I definitely was remiss welcoming Ms. Martin back, but it's as if she never left us.
It's like you never left.
All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thanks.